If tonight you are lying in a quiet, dark room and you just want your mind to drift away from everything that happened today, then maybe let us go back to a time very far away, to a place where the universe did not yet have a name, where the Titans existed long before Zeus, long before humans could remember. Greek myths are usually told like thunder and tragedy, but tonight we will tell it differently. Slow, dim, a little drawn out, just boring enough to make you sleepy, like an old mist settling on your final thought before your eyes close. And if you enjoy nights like this, stories that are not meant to awaken you, but to make you sleepy in a gentle way, you can, maybe, gently tap subscribe, so that every night when you lie down, another door can open for you to step through. For now, you don't have to do anything. Just be still. Breathe slowly. Let the day loosen its grip. It's okay to let go. And we will begin from chaos, the place where everything in the universe had not yet taken shape. The ancient Greeks did not see monsters as irrational beings appearing just to scare people at random. In their way of thinking, nothing existed just to make an audience panic. Every monster was placed in its exact spot inside the structure of the cosmos, like the keystones in a temple arch. Remove one part and the whole order would collapse. For the Greeks, the frightening thing was not the monster's body, but the truth it stood for. A truth humans could not negotiate with, could not bargain with, could not escape by prayer or will. A monster was not the other, but what remains after every explanation fails. When philosophy becomes powerless, when law cannot intervene, when the gods will not change their minds, what is left on the human path is the monster. Not to kill people, but to force humans to understand that some boundaries exist not to be bargained with, but to remind. That is why, in Greek myth, monsters are always tied to a specific deviation, a broken oath, a reversed order of power, a natural limit crossed, a collective memory denied. They do not come from nowhere. They are the evidence of a violation. And because of that, monsters in Greek myth are rarely destroyed by pure force. Someone with muscles and instinct will die before touching a monster's skin. The Greeks understood. If a monster embodies a principle of the universe, then to pass it, you must understand the principle, not break it. The Gorgon does not die from a strong sword, but because Perseus understood the rule, do not face directly a truth that turns you to stone. The Minotaur is not defeated in the maze by bravery, but by knowledge, a thin thread, but correct. Notice, monsters are not enemies of the world. They are part of it. They do not destroy order, they enforce it. Scylla and Charybdis do not exist to tear ships apart for no reason. They exist to prove that some journeys have no safe option, and wisdom is not choosing the good, but choosing the less ruinous. The Furies do not appear to kill, but to prevent forgetting, to say that some blood debts may not be buried with the dead. Harpies do not kill, but exhaust, because some punishments are slow and silent and worse than blades. By now you see Greek thinking is not like the common fantasy of a primitive, superstitious world. They did not use monsters to explain what they did not understand. They used monsters to define what they understood too well, but would not say out loud. They turned abstract forces like shame, betrayal, forgetting, ambition, pride, jealousy, into forms, so humans could not pretend those things do not exist. A monster, in the Greek sense, is a truth wearing skin, not to be seen, but to prevent denial. And, if you notice, the most infamous monsters in myth never come from ownerless chaos. They are born from a chain of causes: a wrong decision not repaired, a bent promise, a power abused. Medusa did not become a monster by accident. She is the result of a punishment. The Minotaur did not live in the maze by chance. He is the product of a shame pushed underground. Scylla was not born with many heads. She was reshaped by resentment. In every monster, there is a verdict not yet closed. And if, right now, your eyes are getting heavier and your breathing is slowing a little, maybe that is okay. Greek myth does not demand you to take sides or rush to understand. It only asks something light. Do not resist the existence of things that cannot be negotiated in life. When the Greeks told stories of monsters, they were speaking to themselves and to all who came after, that some truths cannot be solved, only walked past with the right understanding. And this is only the beginning. In the next part, we will see why Perseus was chosen, because the gods never use their interventions wastefully. Breathe. Let it sit. It's okay to relax now. In Greek myth, no divine intervention is random. The gods do not appear because they are amused, or compassionate, or fond of one special human. When they place their hand into mortal life, it is always the next step of a logic that already exists. A logic humans cannot fully see simply because we stand too close to the surface of events. Perseus was not chosen for strength and not chosen for goodness. He was chosen because he stood at the exact crossing of three things: a valid origin, a vulnerable position, and an empty space in his fate where the gods could implant their will. Perseus was born of Zeus and immortal, meaning he belongs partly to the high realm and partly to the low one. That is the ideal configuration for a mission. A full god is bound by divine rules. A full human is trapped by human weakness. But a half is the loophole. The divine half gives access to resources. The human half gives flexibility to bend divine restrictions. The gods cannot simply kill a monster themselves if that would distort the order. They must act through a middle entity, so their will is carried out without breaking the structure. Perseus is a legal mechanism, not a favored person. Second factor, Perseus is forced into the mission. He cannot refuse. A hero cannot be someone who volunteers for glory. Ambition would stain the logic of the outcome. The Greeks understood a correct task must be given to someone who did not chase it. So his actions are not colored by his own agenda. Perseus is pushed into departure, not because he wants to, but because he has no other way to continue existing. Fate works best when it chooses someone at the point of no alternative. Third factor, Perseus is young and not yet filled. In Greek myth, those with dense experience are rarely chosen for first missions. Their minds are too crowded with their own narratives and memories. A mind still soft will absorb divine guidance like water into fresh earth, without pushing back. The gods do not look for the most capable. They look for someone with enough empty room to contain their design. From these three, Perseus becomes both reasonable and inevitable. Not special in a personal sense, but special in the structure of fate. The gods intervene not to protect a human, but to protect order. Medusa, with the power to turn living beings into stone, is not merely dangerous, she is a principle running beyond the allowed boundary. If no one removes the Gorgon at the right moment, the rules that regulate fear and punishment will tilt. The most dangerous thing in the Greek universe is not a monster, but a monster located in the wrong place at the wrong time. And because the goal is order, not victory, the gods do not send Perseus unarmed to test him. They provide tools, instructions, rules. Athena gives a polished shield, not to kill, but to see the truth indirectly so it will not destroy him. Hermes gives the curved blade, not to slash wildly, but to signal that a monster must be resolved by the correct angle of action, not brute collision. The magic pouch for the Gorgon's head, proof the task does not end when the cut is made. Consequences must be contained. In the Greek view, tools are part of destiny, because tools are the language that states how a victory is allowed to occur. If the universe wanted strength to win, it would give muscle. But the universe gives a mirror, a cord, rules. That says clearly, victory must come from understanding, not from impact. Violence against a principle only breeds a stronger principle. By now, we see. Perseus is not chosen to become great. He is chosen to maintain balance. Fame and glory are byproducts, not purpose. The Greeks tell this not to praise a hero, but to remind that every divine intervention has logic. And mortals, when chosen, must not mistake it as personal blessing. If your eyes are slowing now, maybe that is normal, because the truth of fate in Greek myth does not ask you to react. It only asks you to accept that some roles we are placed into not because we want them, but because we are the one who fits the exact configuration required. In the next part, we will enter the tools and rules of monster slaying, where the Greeks reveal that in their universe, victory, knowledge, not force. Breathe. Let it settle. You are okay. When Perseus received the task, no god gave him muscle or a charm that made him untouchable. Everything he was given required understanding before use. The mirror-bright shield to look at Medusa without being turned to stone. The curved blade to strike from a safe angle instead of facing her head-on. The magic pouch to contain the head after it is severed. Because the death of a monster does not mean the end of its effects. And the winged sandals to escape the killing zone before whatever remains can spread. Not a single item is pure brute force. Every item is a way to regulate danger with knowledge. In Greek myth, raw strength never defeats a symbol. Only the correct reading of the principle behind the symbol can do that. The Greeks tell this story not to glorify tools, but to say that the one who survives is the one who obeys the rule, not the one who rushes to break it. Perseus wins not because of courage, but because he knows what he must not do. He must not look. He must not strike from the wrong line. He must not ignore the aftermath once the blade has already fallen. And that is what the Greeks want to engrave. A monster is a law of the universe wearing skin, and a law is only surpassed when we act according to the way it demands, not when we smash through it with violence. If your breathing has slowed a little, maybe that is fine. Greek myth does not ask you to admire loud heroics, it asks you to notice the quiet logic beneath them. The gods do not hand weapons to express kindness. They hand instructions that reveal the one path where victory is lawful. In their world, to kill is not enough. To kill correctly is the real condition. Because a wrong approach to a true principle does not remove it. It multiplies it. Maybe let that sit for a moment. Breathe. You are enough. In the next part, we will follow Perseus into the approach, the moment before the strike, where silence is not hesitation, but compliance with a higher rule. Perseus entered the place where the Gorgons slept, not with the posture of a hunter, but like someone simply carrying out something already decided on a higher layer of logic. Medusa and her two sisters did not scream, did not flee. There was no air of a battlefield, only a state that existed, and a state that was about to be replaced. When Perseus lifted the polished shield, he was not looking at a monster. He was looking at a principle, that there are truths which, if faced directly, will destroy us, so we must approach them indirectly to survive. The downward motion of the curved blade was not like an act of killing, but like a timestamp closing a period. What matters after that moment is not noise or blood, but the fact that a structure of order had been switched. Something that once acted as an instrument of punishment no longer operated in its previous form. From the place where the old principle ended, two new beings came forth, Pegasus and Chrysaor. In Greek thinking, this is not magic. It is logic. When a pattern is terminated, the energy trapped inside it must change form. Pegasus, the winged horse, represents the release of a force once locked in punishment. Chrysaor, the warrior figure, represents a latent violence exiting its private domain and entering a world with history. Meaning, from the ending of one mode of penalty, two kinds of force, one rising upward, one entering the timeline of human affairs, step out. The Greeks are not saying blood creates myth. They are saying when a punishment ceases, the power that held it converts. Medusa's head, once severed, does not turn into a dead object. It continues to carry the power to petrify. This matters deeply. When a principle is removed from its original position, it does not vanish. It changes state. Perseus placing the head in the leather sack is not concealment, but management, because the Greeks believe that victory is not destruction, but the regulation of what remains. If a monster is a principle wearing flesh, then the death of the monster is the transfer of that principle into a new form. Placing it into the bag is an admission that power must be contained, not released to drift. In the whole scene, the memory to keep is not the cut, but the clarity. Perseus does not linger to admire the result, does not treat it as glory, but departs at once on winged sandals, because the Greeks understand there are places where, once the necessary act is done, we must leave before the residue of the truth can rise back and drown us. Victory is not a place to stay. It is a moment to leave correctly. If you are listening in the dark, you may notice how the Greek logic is the opposite of modern storytelling. They do not freeze the narrative at the kill. They do not glorify the slayer. They do not demand an emotional climax. They guide us through the event the way one walks through a threshold. Calm without trembling, without applause, because what they revere is not blood, it is structure. Pegasus and Chrysaor are not rewards for killing. They are the reallocation of energy after a principle's function has ended. The head is not a trophy. It is evidence that a truth still persists, now in a different casing. The departure is not escape. It is obedience to the logic that even after the right thing is done, the residue of it can still swallow someone who lingers too long. You may notice your breathing has slowed a little. Maybe that is fine. This part of the myth is not asking you to feel triumph. It is asking you to observe how the Greeks separate ending the form from ending the truth. In their worldview, nothing is annihilated, only reassigned. And with that, one Greek insight stands clear at the end of this section. The death of a monster is the change of shape of a truth, not its disappearance. In the next part, we will see why Medusa's head, instead of being buried, becomes a political weapon and a tool of restraint after death. Breathe. It's okay. Let the thought dim slowly. After Medusa ceased to operate as a living entity, her head was not destroyed or buried. It was kept and used according to the nature of the principle it embodied, a device that forces the world to remember its limit. Perseus carried that head not as a trophy, but as a tool to enforce the extended portion of a sentence. When he pointed the head at someone, he was not killing. He was reactivating the petrifying principle that already existed, merely assigning it to a new target. From that moment on, the head functioned as a technology of power. It guaranteed that certain actions would end instantly without debate. In Greek thought, that is the role of a legitimate punitive symbol. No dialogue, no re-examination, no negotiation. A structure of order stays firm exactly when it does not have to explain itself each time it is applied. The head of Medusa performs that logic. It ends arguments not by persuasion, but by a result that cannot be reversed. Its existence is not meant to frighten. It is meant to shorten the handling of wrongdoing from a long process down to a single point. When Perseus gave the head to Athena, that act made the political nature of the head even clearer. Athena did not keep it out of emotion, and not to display human triumph over a monster. She fixed it to a shield, turning it into a layer of principle-based defense. A head mounted on a shield is a mechanism of reminder, not aggression. Greek belief is explicit. Order does not stand on goodness, but on the ability to stop disorder from returning fast enough. Petrification is not violence. It is the freezing of deviation before it grows. Placing the head on the shield also carries a structural meaning. Power must be institutionalized, put into a thing that represents law, not kept in a private hand. Perseus could use the head while still traveling because he was executing a mission. But once the mission ended, the head had to return to Athena, meaning the power to punish must return to an authority, not remain with an individual. A stable society, in Greek logic, is not one without punishment, but one where punishment is no longer private property. The crucial point is this: the head of Medusa is not neutralized by being collected. It is relocated into a position where only those with authority can activate it in the correct context. This reveals a quiet Greek ethic. Danger does not lie in strength itself, but in strength without boundary. Putting the head under Athena's governance turns it from a roaming threat into a component of order. If you lie still in the dark and think slowly, you will see the through line. Medusa alive, a sentence in operation. Medusa killed, the sentence changes form. Medusa after death, the sentence is installed into an institution to stabilize the world. No phase falls into chaos or emotion. The Greeks recount this as a cold lesson. The frightening thing is not the existence of punishment, but whether punishment has a proper place to act and a proper place to stop. From here, the final function is clear. Death does not liberate the world from a monster. Death only transfers the monster's power into the vault of order. And this is how the Greeks think about power. Not extinguish, but position and govern. Maybe breathe for a moment before moving on. You do not have to feel anything about it. Acknowledgement is enough. In the next part, we will follow how the Greeks moved from individual intervention to institutional symbolism, and why weapons of principle always outlive the hands that carried them. In the original structure of the story, Medusa was not a monster from the start. She was once human. An initial condition existing before a punishment turned her into a symbol of retribution. At that first tier, Medusa is the origin point of a legitimate punishment. An individual converted into a stable, punitive form. But once her head was placed on Athena's shield, the meaning of Medusa changed state, from the punished into the instrument of punishment. The victim became a tool. At this stage, Medusa is no longer read as a story about a person, but as an operating component of order. Once the memory of origin is sealed, function becomes the dominant meaning. From this point on, the figure of Medusa held a new meaning for more than a millennium. The meaning of a protective agent, a layer of defense built on passive deterrence. The Greeks carved Medusa's image onto shields, armor, temple doors, city gates, not to retell the story, but to fix the function, to stop the wrong before it begins. At this stage, Medusa no longer narrates, no longer has a biography. She is standardized into a sign, like the carved bow on a soldier's tomb. It does not tell who shot it. It only names the function it once represented. When the world entered the later Greco-Roman era and then medieval Christianity, Medusa continued to be preserved in the form of a sign that sees in place of law. No one needed to recall the cause of her transformation. Only the fact remained. This symbol stands for a form of prevention. In the process of sign-making, this is the step of erasing causality and keeping function. The weight of the symbol no longer depends on its historical foundation. It persists by utility. It was only in the early modern to modern period, when the rereading of ancient symbols began as an intellectual practice, that Medusa shifted meaning again. This time not by punishment, not by power, but by interpretation. At this stage, Medusa is no longer viewed as a guardian tool, but as a sign that once was legitimate as a guardian tool. That is, the new meaning lies in distance. Medusa is not used to protect. She is used as evidence of how symbols were used, from punitive symbol to protective symbol to symbol of the mechanism of symbolization itself. From there, the modern distortions appear. Medusa in contemporary art, in symbolic philosophy, in popular culture no longer stands for punishment and no longer stands for protection, but stands for the human act of redefining power through symbols. This is the third layer of meaning, no longer inside the mythic world, but inside the world that reads myth. Thus, the meaning shift of Medusa can be read coldly as a three-step chain. A human turned into an instrument of punishment. Meaning 1, sentence. A punitive symbol reused as a protective layer. Meaning 2, guardian. A guardian symbol reread as evidence of the mechanism of symbolic power. Meaning 3, modern object of analysis. None of the three layers depends on emotion. Layer 1 is causal punishment. Layer 2 is functional order. Layer 3 is the reinterpretive act. That people today know Medusa mostly through modern debates does not change the fundamental nature of this progression. Semantic shift is the inevitable result when a sign survives long enough across contexts. If you are lying and listening, this part does not ask for empathy or judgment. It only asks you to see something deeply Greek. Every symbol that lives through time passes through a cycle. Mean. Be used. Be reread. In the next part, we move away from Medusa and enter another structure, the Strait of Scylla Charybdis, a world with no safe choice. In the journey of Odysseus, there's a turn that permits no clean exit. To the left is Scylla, a being that devours a few, but certainly. To the right is Charybdis, a whirlpool able to consume the entire ship. The choice is not between save and destroy, but between limited loss and total loss. This is what the Greeks wanted to inscribe into collective memory. There exist situations where the right decision does not produce a good outcome. It only prevents a disaster from becoming absolute. Odysseus was not given a miracle to pass without cost. That is not his fault. It is the property of the space. The Greeks used this scene to model a condition. Risk does not disappear. It only transfers its share. If he chose Charybdis, he would wager the entire crew against a total destruction probability. If he chose Scylla, he would accept a guaranteed loss, but in a controlled amount. In modern language, minimize maximum loss. Reduce the largest possible damage instead of hoping for zero. Within this logic, no one is called cruel for losing a few. One is called irrational for risking total collapse. What the Greeks praised is not compassion, but the ability to evaluate impossible structures correctly. When a decision field contains no good branch, wisdom lies in recognizing that safety does not belong to the option set. To continue moral debate inside a structure that does not allow full rescue is a category error, not a moral one. Scylla Charybdis is therefore not a lesson in necessary suffering, not a lesson in the price of fate, but a lesson in how humans act inside defective decision spaces, where every road carries embedded loss. Greek myth rarely offers escape both sides. They do not train humans to dream of clean choices. They train them to select the path that destabilizes the system the least. From this angle, Odysseus did not sacrifice a group. He fixed the loss at a lower ceiling. The acceptance of partial death does not come from cold-heartedness, but from the logic of the decision field, either a certain small loss or a gamble on total annihilation. The Greeks treat the death of a few sailors as a quantity already priced, and the survival of the rest as the quantity preserved by correct choice. If you are lying in the dark, you may notice. Life is not always harsh. Some structures simply do not generate clean choices. Accepting that does not make us pessimistic. It only removes the illusion that every turn can be passed without payment. In the next part, we will go deeper into the first half of this structure. Scylla, the distorted figure born from jealousy and the punishment of women in myth. In the earliest layer of the story, Scylla does not begin as a punitive entity. She exists before the event, in a state that carries no function of punishment. The deformation occurs only when a conflict involving jealousy pulls her into the orbit of retribution. Meaning, Scylla is not the source of disturbance. She is the recipient of the consequence of another conflict. An action not caused by her produces a new form of existence placed upon her. This is a structural pattern common in Greek myth. A neutral subject pulled into a cost-paying chain simply because it stood in the correct position at the wrong time. Jealousy, whether of mortals or of gods, in Greek myth does not remain at the emotional level. It is quickly converted into material punishment. When jealousy cannot be resolved by words, it is legalized through bodily alteration, making the target no longer eligible to return to the initial state. Scylla is deformed not to be removed from the world, but to be fixed into a new role, the role of punishing in the place of the original source of jealousy. This is the crucial link. The cause disappears from the cycle, while the punishment is retained in a stable form. From the moment deformation is complete, Scylla no longer belongs to the domain of personal tragedy. She enters the domain of cosmic structure. She becomes a mandatory waypoint in a route. Her new condition is to consume 6 sailors per passing ship, meaning a mechanism with a set quota. Not spontaneous brutality, a capped loss. This fits Greek logic. Once punishment is issued, it must enter a rule, not remain in emotion. Punishment becomes a fixed function, not an act. Rather than eliminating Scylla, myth keeps her in a designated station so she can serve as durable deterrence. A personal sentence is reused as a maritime stabilizer, a kind of infrastructure of punishment. The Greeks do not need anyone to remember why she was transformed. That belongs to a closed past. What they need is for the function to continue. Whoever passes must pay a fixed loss. Forgetting the cause does not invalidate the penalty. In Greek logic, once made legitimate, punishment is independent of memory. The fact that Scylla remains as a permanent warning also shows a recurring rule. In Greek myth, products of punishment are rarely revoked even after the original conflict ends. Once a form is issued, it continues to live as a unit of the cosmos, even when the chain of reasons behind it is fully sealed. In modern language, this could be named the irreversibility of mythical sentencing. Judgment does not return. It only transfers hosts. If you are listening in the dark, the point is not sympathy or outrage, but logic. An emotional conflict at its origin can produce a long-term punitive structure that outlives the people who triggered it. Scylla no longer tells the story of the jealous agent. She tells the story of a consequence that has detached from its source. In every reappearance of Scylla in later tellings, the hearer is not reminded of jealousy, only of detour or pay. The cause is hidden, the function is kept. Scylla is therefore a typical case of transformation in Greek myth, a psychological event converted into a hard deterrence mechanism, moving from the layer of emotion to the layer of structure. Once deformation is complete, she is no longer a narrative. She is a rule. In the next section, to complete the symmetry, we move to the other side of the strait, Charybdis, where a political act is punished by being turned into a permanent natural phenomenon. In Greek myth, Charybdis does not appear as a being that always existed, but as the afterform of a political act translated into a permanent punishment. The origin story centers on Charybdis seizing resources, specifically land that belonged to Zeus, by swallowing seawater to expand territory for Poseidon. That act is not emotional. It is an intervention into the structure of power distribution among the gods. When law is challenged at the highest tier, the boundary between supreme jurisdictions, the punishment must be proportional, not against the body, but against the function of existence. Zeus does not delete Charybdis from the cosmos. he converts her into a devouring whirlpool placed precisely where it can swallow whatever passes. Instead of punishing once, Zeus fixes the punishment as natural infrastructure, so that all later generations must face it as a permanent barrier. The Greeks do not tell this as revenge, but as a precedent case. When supreme power is violated, punishment will not stay temporary. It will be installed as a world condition. This clarifies a deep Greek rule. Punishment at the top of the political hierarchy does not target the offender, but targets perpetuity. Killing a person ends an event. Recasting the condition extends it. Charybdis becomes politicized geography, a political fault turned into environment. From that point on, anyone crossing the strait must negotiate with the punishment of an act committed before them. The Greeks understood that some deviations do not die with the violator. They live on as structures that force later life to pay a tax. If Scylla is a personal punishment reused as a quota-based deterrence, then Charybdis is a political punishment reformatted into natural law. One consumes 6, fixed quota. One can erase all, systemic risk. The Greeks do not place them side by side to measure which is more cruel. They place them to differentiate consequences of two categories of acts: an emotional act, limited punishment; a political act, unlimited punishment. Charybdis is no longer a lesson addressed to the original offender. She is a signpost erected for everyone after. Seen that way, Charybdis does not belong to the past. It belongs to the future. It exists to ensure that a similar act will never repeat, not by memory, but by a fixed cost embedded in the world. No one needs to recall why it is there. It is enough that they must account for it in every decision at sea. If you are listening in the dark, the point to hold is not pity or blame, but structure. In Greek myth, some acts at the level of power are not punished with memory. They are punished with geography. Not revocable, not negotiable, not persuadable, only avoidable or payable. And because of that, Scylla Charybdis are symmetrical not in form, but in logic. One fixes the minimum loss, the other fixes the maximum risk of total loss. From this, the problem Odysseus must solve emerges in the next part. Choose the bounded damage instead of gambling on total annihilation. As the ship approached the zone between Scylla and Charybdis, Odysseus did not stand before the choice of save or not save. He stood inside a structure that contains no safe branch. There is no decision path that returns a loss value of 0. Therefore, the question is not, how do I lose no one? But, what is the smallest acceptable loss? This kind of decision only appears when the environment does not permit the absolute value of safety. If he steers too close to Charybdis, the entire crew is erased. Total system risk. If he turns towards Scylla, 6 men will be taken with a probability of 100%. Bounded risk. In decision logic, Odysseus does not kill anyone. He prevents a worse outcome. The Greeks frame this not to teach courage or compassion, but to record a principle. When no loss-free choice exists, right means choosing the smallest loss. One notable detail: Odysseus does not announce his decision to the crew. He keeps silent because in this model, disclosure does not change the outcome. It only increases noise in the system. For the Greeks, silence is part of the solution. A correct decision is not required to be explained before execution. Speaking does not reduce the number of deaths. It only destabilizes those who do not know the decision model. When Scylla takes 6 men, the myth does not linger on screams or panic. This is not due to missing detail. It is because such detail has no value inside the logic of the problem. What matters is that the ship continues forward. Odysseus's effort is not directed at saving everyone, but at preserving the system's ability to continue existing. This is how the Greeks teach that in certain situations, continuable matters more than intact. Instead of calling those 6 sacrifices, we may read them as the fixed price for purchasing the right to proceed. Not morality, mechanism. Once the infinite loss branch is eliminated, the helmsman's task is complete. The event ends exactly where it must, without moral after-debate, because moral debate does not change the arithmetic of the scene. If you are lying in the dark, the essential recognition in this part is not pain, but the format of certain decisions in life. There exist turning points that do not test character. They test one's ability to see the nature of the equation. Odysseus is neither praised for humanity nor blamed for cruelty. He is recorded for selecting the option that collapses the system the least. Once the strait is passed, the story does not return to question him. Greek myth leaves no space for what if. When a risk has concluded, the decision is not retried. That is their cold philosophy. Optimal decisions exist only in the moment of emergence, not in hindsight. With Part 10, the Scylla-Charybdis chain is closed as a decision model, not as a tragedy. And from here, we leave the sea and return to land, to another chain of retribution logic. Minos breaks his promise. The chain of punishment extends to the next generation. Breathe. It is okay to let the logic settle. Minos once asked Poseidon to send a pure white bull from the sea so he could offer it as sacrifice to confirm his legitimacy as king. He promised he would sacrifice it the moment he received it. Poseidon agreed, not out of favor for Minos, but because the promise created a binding structure. When a god fulfills a human request, the human must complete the other half so that the system of order remains closed. But when the bull appeared, Minos changed his plan. He kept it for himself and substituted an inferior animal for the sacrifice. That single act fractured the structure of the promise at the one point where deviation is not permissible, the origin point of a pact with a god. In Greek logic, a broken vow is not merely the failure of one person, it is a tear in the order, and a tear must be sealed by punishment. But instead of striking Minos directly, the punishment shifts to the layer of indirect linkage, forming a chain. Pasiphae, Minos's wife, is forced to carry a deformation that leads to the birth of the Minotaur. The child born from that deformation becomes a device of punishment. Later, the entire city of Crete bears the cost through a recurring tribute of Athenian youths sacrificed into the labyrinth. This is not random misfortune, but the continuation wave designed to fill the deficit created by the broken promise. Minos is not struck directly because his position in the power structure means any force applied to him could collapse other parts of the system. Instead, the punishment moves laterally, like water rerouting, but still landing at the exact level needed to rebalance. The punishment falling on Pasiphae is not to teach her anything. It is to restore the number required to compensate the broken vow. When the Minotaur is born, it is not merely a biological outcome. It is a component of the penalty mechanism. When Athens must deliver 7 boys and 7 girls each cycle, that is not a political negotiation. It is an installment payment on an original breach. The whole chain reveals a Greek property. Punishment does not have to return to the same body that caused the error. It returns to the exact degree of disruption the error created. If the deviation spreads widely, the punishment also spreads widely. If the broken vow originates at the top of a hierarchy, the cost may descend to lower tiers. Not out of injustice, but because that is the only way to close the system without collapsing it. The Greeks do not tell this to condemn Minos. They tell it to show that a broken vow, when placed at the wrong height, can generate intergenerational catastrophe with no proper exit for anyone involved. Seen from distance, Minos, though not struck at once, does not escape punishment. He lives in a world where everyone around him must pay for his breach, and that creates an indirect ring of penalty around him for life. There is no need to kill him. It is enough to make every surrounding structure absorb the cost, forcing him to live inside the product of his own deviation until the end. Punishment does not strike his body. It strikes the environment he must inhabit. If you are listening with your eyes growing heavy, that is the natural rhythm of this kind of narrative. It does not provoke anger. It does not ask for pity. It simply states a very cold Greek law. A vow once tied to the divine cannot be withdrawn without its deficit being filled by someone else's life. In the next part, the chain continues into its symbolic form. Minotaur, the monster as the product of shame concealed. Breathe slowly. Do not interpret. Just let the structure settle. The Minotaur is not born to be a monster. It is created to contain something that cannot be allowed to exist in public language. In the causal chain of Minos, when the vow to Poseidon is broken, the punishment does not only deform Pasiphae's body, it generates a piece of information that must be kept out of light. That information, if it survives in words, records, or memory, would collapse the legitimacy of the king. Therefore, it requires a form of existence that cannot spread by speech, a living container. The Minotaur, with its hybrid form between human and bull, is not a sight engineered to frighten, but a sign to mark that this is not a natural creature. The hybrid structure is a code. This entity does not belong to ordinary biology. It is born from a deviation that must be locked. The Greeks do not describe the Minotaur to excite emotion. They describe it to encode the deviation into flesh, so that no one can claim it was a normal being hidden for other reasons. From this angle, the Minotaur does not exist in place of Pasiphae, nor in place of Minos, but in place of the function of hiding a political breach. Instead of letting that information leak through rumor, which cannot be controlled, Minos transfers it into a living vessel, places it inside an enclosed space, and seals it by architecture. A deviation is locked with 2 layers: the biological layer, the Minotaur, and the spatial layer, the labyrinth. Meaning, punishment does not only create the object, it creates the chamber that buries it. Once the Minotaur is placed inside the maze, it ceases to exist as an individual and becomes an extension of a political decision that must remain sealed. Each time Athens sends youths to their deaths, the purpose is not to feed a creature, it is to maintain the seal, to prevent anyone from using the Minotaur's existence as evidence to overthrow Minos. Every life delivered is a reinforcement of silence. Viewed on that axis, the Minotaur is a rare case. A monster not created to punish the world, but to imprison the evidence of a wrongdoing at the top. It is not made to attack the living world. It is made to prevent the world from seeing a certain truth. Shame is not treated as an inner feeling. It is modeled as a datum that cannot be allowed to circulate, and the Minotaur is the material formatting of that datum. And when the narrative reaches the moment Theseus later kills the Minotaur, the Greeks do not frame that as defeating a monster, but as unsealing a secret buried in flesh and in walls. The death of the Minotaur does not destroy a being. It unlocks something that had been held down. Because of that, even the death scene is not written as a climax. It is written as a phase change, a passage of information back into the public zone. If you are listening in the dark, the point to retain is not an impression of the Minotaur, but the recognition of its function. The Minotaur is not a character. It is a storage mechanism for shame in a form that cannot be broadcast. Once seen this way, the figure returns to its Greek role, not to frighten imagination, but to fix a logic about how the world deals with deviation, by burying it in a form harder to speak than words. In the next section, we move to the second layer of concealment, the labyrinth, the architecture of burial, where the more something must not be known, the more complex the structure built around it becomes. The labyrinth was not built to confuse those who enter it. It was built to fix a secret in a state that cannot be undone. When Minos could not allow the Minotaur to die, because the death of the Minotaur would release the information he needed to suppress, and could not allow it to exist in daylight, he needed a structure sealed enough that the deviation could be caged without needing to be erased. In that sense, the maze becomes the second cost of the broken vow. The first cost is the existence of the Minotaur. The second cost is the space required to hide it. And, like all hidden errors, the cost does not freeze at the starting point. The larger the deviation, the more complex the cover must be to guarantee no leakage. The labyrinth is not merely a wall system. It is a complexity function designed to prevent retrieval. The more turns, the more candidate paths, the closer the probability of contact with the truth approaches zero. In information theory, this is the primary rule. When a datum cannot be deleted, the entropy around it must be raised so it is buried in noise. From the moment the labyrinth is built, Minos is no longer facing a single mistake, but a chain of maintenance obligations. He must feed and guard the system that contains it, must hide from the public the real function of the structure, must generate a replacement narrative to legitimize its existence, must maintain the periodic tribute so the sealing mechanism is never broken. The original deviation, once a single point, is multiplied into a long-term system of sustaining silence. The Greeks narrate this coldly. When a deviation is hidden rather than corrected, its cost always increases over time, never decreases. The labyrinth is not a reaction. It is evidence that Minos chose to keep the error alive rather than to close the error. A living error always demands an architecture around it, and that architecture becomes a permanent burden, not a one-time act. The notable detail is this: the labyrinth does not only hide the Minotaur, it also hides the nature of the labyrinth itself. The maze is not presented as a prison for a fault, but as a work of art, as a proof of Crete's greatness. Meaning, to hide one deviation, Minos must generate an additional layer, a layer of legitimizing discourse. He not only hides the truth, he manufactures a new story to conceal the purpose of hiding it. That adds yet another layer of cost. If you read the sequence as a function, you see expansion, not closure. A single error produces a creature, Minotaur, the creature, necessitates an architecture, Labyrinth, the architecture, necessitates a ritual, tribute payments, the ritual, necessitates a discourse shell, Crete's glory. Deviation does not stand still. It breeds an ecosystem required to maintain its concealment. If you are listening in the dark, this is not a moral lesson. It is a structural warning. Hiding a deviation does not shrink it. It forces it to be fed by ever-increasing cost. The labyrinth does not teach that Minos is weak. It teaches that anything forbidden from appearing in light will evolve into a form that is harder and harder to dismantle. In the next section, we move from the architecture of concealment to the architecture of escape. Theseus and Ariadne, where victory is not by blade, but by thread. Knowledge as the only solvent. When Theseus arrived in Crete, his objective was not to kill a monster for personal glory, but to sever the cycle of life payments Athens was forced to make for Minos's breached vow. But to break the cycle, killing the Minotaur alone was insufficient. It had to be done without losing the one who entered the labyrinth. This is no longer a strength problem. It is an exit problem. No one needs a hero who wins if the hero does not return. The Minotaur is the product of a broken promise. The labyrinth is the sealing layer of that concealed promise. Theseus must neutralize both with a single solution. Ariadne enters not as an emotional accident, but as a standardized information channel. She provides a thread, not as a symbol of relational attachment, but as an escape algorithm, converting a no-exit space into a graph with a retraceable path. The thread removes the labyrinth's irreversibility, not through force, but through anchoring a reference point. From the moment the thread is tied to the entrance, the labyrinth ceases to be an untraceable structure. It becomes a reversible space. That is the actual victory. Not the killing of the Minotaur, but the killing of the labyrinth's monopoly on containment. Thus, Ariadne's role is not saving Theseus, but supplying extra system knowledge to an agent inside the system in order to produce an exit that did not exist in the system's original design. In Greek logic, this is the only valid mode of intervention against a structure built to have no out, not by breaking walls, but by adding information. Knowledge is the only external force that can disable a space engineered to defeat violence. The moment Theseus kills the Minotaur is the second half of the problem. The first, the deciding half, is guaranteeing the return path before attacking. The Greeks record this not to praise Theseus's cleverness, but to assert a rule. A victory is only legitimate when coupled with the ability to withdraw. A victory without return is a failure of another kind. Those sacrificed earlier did not die from insufficient courage. They died from insufficient information. Ariadne supplies the one missing variable, not motivation, but data. What she does is not romantic in Greek logic. She does not provide comfort, does not accompany, does not share risk. She only inserts one necessary variable to change the output of the system. In that sense, Ariadne is not a love secondary character, but the infrastructure of victory, equivalent to Athena's tools for Perseus, not replacing the fight, but determining its ending. This leads to a cold conclusion. The Minotaur is not defeated by Theseus's force, but by knowledge injected from outside the system. The thread proves that every concealment architecture, even one as complex as the labyrinth, is only absolute when those inside have no anchor point for reversion. Ariadne supplies exactly the thing the labyrinth was built to suppress: reversibility. If you are listening in the dark, notice. This part does not ask us to love or hate anyone. It states a Greek law. Violence is a subordinate factor in victory. Knowledge changes system state. Theseus killing the Minotaur merely completes the visible part. Ariadne alters the underlying conditions. In the next section, we move to the layer of consequence, the price of escape. Victory produces its own casualties. Ariadne, Aegeus, where the Greeks show that even correct victories carry losses, not as tragedy, but as part of the balancing ledger. Breathe slowly. No emotional reading required. Just hold the structure. When Theseus killed the Minotaur and left the labyrinth using Ariadne's thread, the cycle of tribute deaths from Athens ended. Structurally, this was a correct decision. It closed a deviation that had persisted for years. But in Greek myth, a correct decision does not erase all aftershock. It only shifts the form of consequence from one region to another. Ariadne is the proof of that delayed cost. Theseus took Ariadne with him, but she did not enter the life created by the victory her knowledge enabled. The versions differ: abandoned, taken away by gods, cut off, but all versions share one invariant. Ariadne does not step into the world that exists because of her intervention. This is not personal tragedy. This is the delayed cost of an ending achieved through an external system break. Ariadne's knowledge is a condition of the solution, but not a component of the resulting state. She exists in the equation, not in the final answer. In parallel, Aegeus, father of Theseus, dies not because of a wrong decision on his part, but because of a delayed signal. Theseus did not change the sail from black to white to indicate survival, and Aegeus misread the state and threw himself into the sea. The Greeks do not tell this to stir sorrow, but to illustrate a principle. When a large cycle is ended, secondary consequences will appear at the system's edges, not from error, but from the latency of information. Ariadne and Aegeus therefore do not represent the cost of mistakes, but the cost of allowing a correct decision to reach global equilibrium. Victory closes the main deviation, but it does not erase the smaller deviations that accumulated around it while it remained open. Those satellite deviations, not targeted by the decision, are allowed to discharge their stored inertia before the system settles. In Greek logic, this is normal. A rational ending does not guarantee a gentle aftermath. They do not confuse those two. The victory of Theseus is not reconsidered as wrong because Ariadne is lost or Aegeus dies. It remains correct. But correctness is not exempt from aftershock. Aftershock does not revise the value of the decision. It completes the curve of the system as it transitions into a new state. If you are listening in the dark, the only idea to retain here is this. In the Greek model, even correct victories carry delayed costs. Therefore, consequences appearing after the decision is not evidence the decision was wrong, but evidence that the system needs a dissipation phase before reaching a new equilibrium. With Part 15, we close the Minotaur Labyrinth Theseus chain as one completed block. A vow is broken. Punishment extends to the next generation. A secret is stored in a body. The body is locked by architecture. The architecture is broken by knowledge. The victory generates delayed aftershock without undoing its correctness. In the next part, we shift to a different form of prolonged punishment, harpies. When punishment does not kill but drains over time, breathe slowly, nothing to judge, only a structure to absorb. In Greek myth, the harpies are not installed as killing instruments. They are deployed in cases where a sentence cannot, or is not yet allowed to, reach its end point, but the condemned also cannot be returned to a normal state. The harpies function as an intermediate institution. They anchor a person in the middle space between two poles, not dead, but no longer alive in any complete sense. The operating logic of the harpies is to remove the conditions that sustain life without removing breath. They do not attack to destroy. They strip away what keeps existence above the threshold of dignity. Not termination, suspension. The human is kept inside a life state too depleted to count as living, so that judgment remains in effect without being concluded. The Greeks designed this class of penalty for situations in which death would close the chain too early, preventing the lesson from propagating into later time. A punishment that ends immediately teaches one generation. A punishment kept open teaches multiple. The harpies are therefore a deliberate delay zone. The final stroke is postponed, so deterrence can accumulate across time. This is the logic of a perpetual remand. The goal is not the end point, but the duration, long enough for the penalty to become collective memory. The Greeks do not insert harpies into myth as embodiments of malice, but as devices of time. Time treated as an active component of punishment, not just a backdrop. Notably, the harpies produce no wounds and spill no blood, yet their effect outweighs blood penalties. They eliminate both exits. The condemned is not allowed to die as release and not allowed to live as recovery. That is the essence of deferred sentencing, locking the closure mechanism so the person is forced to remain inside the sentence, with no escape path in either direction. In Greek reasoning, this carries a juridical nature, not an emotional one. When a sentence has not yet spread far enough, it is not allowed to close. The harpies are the tool that keeps the sentence open. Once a sentence is open, memory must be maintained. Once memory has penetrated deeply enough, closure may occur, but not before. If you are listening, the point to retain in this section is not the shape of the harpies, but their function in the punitive order. The harpies exist to prolong punishment until it completes its social mission, not until the event is over. The harshness lies not in what the harpies do, but in the command that forbids the closing of the case. In the next part, we move from deferred punishment to memory-based punishment, the Furies, justice of remembrance. Not to kill, but to forbid forgetting. Breathe. Keep the tone flat. Just track the mechanism. In Greek myth, the Furies do not appear to sow terror at random. They are activated in cases where a serious crime has occurred but lies outside the reach of existing institutions of justice, or has been deliberately ignored. The Furies are a correctional mechanism, Where law does not reach, they reach. Where judgment is stalled, they push. Where memory is pushed to the margins, they drag it back to the center. Crucially, the Furies do not represent revenge. Revenge belongs to personal emotion. The Furies represent the compulsory restoration of balance when balance does not restore itself. They do not demand blood for satisfaction. They demand recognition of guilt to restabilize order. What they pursue is not the offender's body, but the legal vacuum in which the offense currently stands. They exist to prevent an act from slipping off the ledger of the world. Their subjects are typically crimes that cannot be processed by ordinary procedure, such as kinslaying, betrayal of blood ties, or crimes sealed inside the house where public adjudication is barred. Without the Furies, such crimes would fall into silence, and silence would convert crime into never happened. The Furies interrupt that by forcing the offender's awareness to remain shackled to the unerasable fact of the act, not to inflict torment for its own sake, but to ensure the sentence is not closed without being spoken. The hinge point is this: the Furies do not kill. If they killed, the crime would die with the body. They keep the offender alive, so that the crime retains a living address. As long as the offender remains alive, the memory remains housed. As long as memory remains, the crime cannot be erased from the world. Their punishment is not pain. It is the fixation of a crime in consciousness, blocking the act of denial. Within the architecture of Greek myth, the Furies function as the final lock of justice. If the law can adjudicate, the Furies do not appear. If the law omits or refuses, the Furies are invoked. Not an outbreak of cosmic anger, but the last security layer of order. If you are listening in the dark, the point to carry forward is not fear of the Furies, but the principle behind them. The Greek world does not allow grave crimes to fall into the region of no one held accountable. If the formal structure does not intervene, an informal, invisible, non-negotiable structure replaces it. Justice in myth never leaves a vacancy. From that foundation, the narrative proceeds to the next transition. Athena will not destroy the Furies. She will transform them into a new, regulated system of justice, instead of letting them continue as raw, unstructured justice running outside the law. In myth, Athena does not intervene because the Furies are wrong. She intervenes because the Furies are correct within an older operating system that has reached the end of its lifespan. Justice based on personal vengeance once functioned as the default when there was no mediating institution. But as the community widened and social relations grew complex, a punitive regime based on direct pursuit ceased to be stable. Athena does not negate the Furies. She transfers their function from action to rule. She establishes the Areopagus, an institution of adjudication, and relocates the Furies from the position of self-executing agents into a structural component of judgment. They no longer hold the power to punish through pursuit, but they are given a seat inside the framework as the voice of blood debt, meaning vengeance is institutionalized, not erased. This is the critical shift. The spirit of the judgment remains. The method of execution changes. In Greek logic, this is not a gentler form. It is a more durable one. Spontaneous justice depends on the presence and intensity of the aggrieved. Institutional justice depends on rules that can be applied repeatedly, regardless of emotion or timing. From then on, the Furies do not have to chase anyone. they supply legitimacy to the sentence. When a court declares judgment, the element of vengeance is considered represented in the process rather than enforced by hand. What Athena does is not appeasement. She places the Furies into a position where they no longer need action to continue existing. In the new mechanism, the memory of the crime no longer sits in the mind of the pursuer. It sits in the public record of law, acknowledged, not hunted. Justice is converted from the act of the injured party to the function of a system. Justice no longer depends on how far the Furies walk. Justice operates even when they stand still. Once justice is embedded in law, vengeance loses its unpredictability. It can no longer erupt at any time in any manner. It is fixed into a procedure. The Greeks treat this as an increase, not a reduction. When vengeance is housed inside law, justice no longer needs to reperform pursuit to prove its presence. If you are listening in the dark, note carefully. This is not the taming of the Furies. It is the conversion of justice from raw force to organized form. The goal is unchanged. The technology is replaced. The Greek cosmos does not forgive crime. It updates the method of handling it. From here, myth moves into a more mature shape of justice. Crime is not settled by blood, but by being recorded in a recognized system, so that it cannot vanish again. In the next part, we shift to the final kind of monster, the Sphinx, where victory lies not in force or ritual, but in answering a question correctly. Breathe slowly. No sentiment needed, only structure. In Greek myth, the Sphinx does not belong to the same class as beings that use teeth, claws, or strength to control the flow of human movement. It uses a question. Those who answer incorrectly die. Not because the Sphinx wants to kill, but because a wrong answer means the person does not belong to the world beyond the threshold the Sphinx guards. The Sphinx does not destroy indiscriminately. It filters. Death is not the goal. It is the consequence of failing the cognitive requirement. From the Greek perspective, the Sphinx makes visible a principle. Certain zones in the world's structure open only to those who grasp the nature of life at the necessary level. Insufficient understanding disqualifies advancement, and in the classical frame, to be excluded from advancement is to exit the stream of life. The Sphinx does not execute like the Minotaur, nor prolong punishment like the Harpies. It enforces an entry condition, and the world behind it is reserved for those who pass. This reveals that the Greeks treat knowledge as a barrier equivalent to stone, wall, or blood. If earlier monsters protected order through physical force or temporal punishment, the Sphinx protects order through the precision of an answer. Its riddle is not a game, but a form of identity verification by cognition. One who does not grasp life at the required level is not qualified to progress further within it. The death of the unqualified is a byproduct of filtration, not its center of intent. If the world beyond demands a higher cognitive quality, exclusion is not cruelty. It is adherence to standard. The Sphinx is stationed at a junction not because the Greeks liked mystery, but because every critical junction needs a selection mechanism to prevent the world beyond from being diluted by those unready for it. Oedipus's correct answer is not told as an intellectual triumph to praise the individual, but as confirmation that he belongs on the far side. The answer does not merely defeat the Sphinx, it renders the filter unnecessary. Once the required condition has been met, the mechanism completes its function and dissolves. The Sphinx disappears not because it is overpowered, but because its role is fulfilled. In Greek reasoning, a device is not kept alive when its purpose has been achieved. If you are lying, still listening, you may recognize the Sphinx does not teach wisdom saves. It teaches something more severe. Some doors do not open for bravery or goodwill. They open only for correct understanding. And those who do not understand correctly are not punished for ignorance. They are removed because they are not suited for what lies beyond the question. With the Sphinx, Greek thought becomes explicit. Not all obstructions in the world are meant to be broken. Some exist to ask who has the right to pass, not who has the force to. In the next part, we move to the closing arc of this chain, the afterlife of monsters, when the creature dies, but the principle that produced it remains. Across Greek mythology, monsters are not created to fill gaps in imagination, nor to cultivate fear. They are built as material forms for things humans cannot process by language: the betrayal of a vow, Minos; the propagation of consequence across generations, Minotaur; the existence of choices without a clean option, Scylla Charybdis; the delay of an unfinished sentence, Harpies; the vacancy in law, Furies; the minimum knowledge required to proceed, Sphinx. All of them are versions of one deeply Greek sentence. This is the part of life that cannot be negotiated. Monsters, in this sense, are not evil. They are boundary points that cannot be crossed without cost. When humans fracture structure, monsters appear not to avenge, but to seal the tear. When life presents a problem with no gentle answer, monsters stand there to remind that not everything has a soft version. When justice is left unconcluded, monsters hold the memory until order is restored. Seen through that lens, monsters do not oppose humanity, they oppose human illusion. They do not kill to win. They kill to preserve the structure we live inside. They do not make the world cruel. They prevent the world from losing its form. Once read this way, the killings in myth are no longer action scenes. They become system corrections. Perseus does not kill Medusa to earn glory, but to restore balance. Odysseus does not lose sailors out of cruelty, but to block total loss. Athena does not tame the Furies for kindness, but to shift justice from raw act into regulated form. Each monster is a reply issued by the world to a deviation that cannot be repaired by speech. And at this point, when the logic is closed, we return to a very Greek principle. Some things are not meant to be defeated. They are meant to be acknowledged. Acknowledged so we do not fight structure with illusion, so we pass with smallest damage, so we stop expecting softness from what was not born to be soft. If your eyes are heavy now, that is the natural state when comprehension finds its landing. You do not need to retain everything. Greek myth never demanded memory, only refusal to deny that some parts of life will not adjust to human desire. Let these layers settle like old dust on carved stone, motionless, uninterpreted, not needing to be argued with. You are not required to conquer them. You are only asked to recognize that they are there, and then let them drift away from the surface of the mind. No need to hold, no need to rehearse. Let the old narrative return to its shelf, and you then breathe slower, and let sleep handle what remains. And so, we have walked a full circle through Greek myth. Not to remember it, not to argue with it, but simply to place the mind into a slower region, less resistant, where history and sleep can coexist without conflict. If your eyes are heavy now, let them fall. You do not need to stay awake just to finish properly. The story has already finished its part. The rest belongs to your sleep. If nights like this make breathing easier for you, you may subscribe or leave a small sign in the comments. Tell me which city you are listening from and at what hour. I still like the thought that one old story can put to sleep people who are very far from one another. And now, no more words are needed. Let your breathing do the rest of the story. Sleep, slow and quiet.